Mr. Speaker, first off, I think it's important that I let you know that I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member from Surrey North. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the House today to speak to Bill S8, an act respecting the safety of drinking water on First Nation lands. Specifically, Bill S8 provides for federal regulations to govern drinking water, water quality standards, and the disposal of wastewater in First Nation communities. These regulations would set out new criteria regarding provisions including the training and certification of operators of drinking and wastewater systems, source water protection, the location, design, construction, modification, maintenance, operation and decommissioning of drinking water systems and wastewater systems, drinking water distribution by truck, the collection and treatment of wastewater, the monitoring, sampling and testing of wastewater and the reporting of test results, and the handling, use and disposal of products of wastewater treatment. Mr. Speaker, as an elected representative from Northern Ontario, I recognize the importance of ensuring that First Nation communities have access to clean drinking water, and I am certain that there is not a member of this House that would oppose the goal of ensuring this basic right. Mr. Speaker, I spoke about it earlier to my colleague from Welland, and we all remember the crisis in Sheshawan First Nation in 2005, where the community was forced to evacuate due to a contaminated water crisis, which left some community members extremely sick and stranded, others in communities like Sudbury for an extended period of time. And I know, Mr. Speaker, I talked about my previous role as the Executive Director of the United Way, and there were so many great organizations in Sudbury that were providing support to these people from Sheshawan, to the First Nation people from Sheshawan. And I had the opportunity of meeting some of the families who were staying in a hotel in Lively. And to the amazement of teenagers and some of the children and even adults that were there, turning the water taps on and off was something that's kind of burned into my brain, Mr. Speaker, because they never had that opportunity before. And to be able to see them sit there and drink a glass of water out of the taps, it makes you think how for granted that we take our drinking water. But in a country like Canada, we need to ensure that our First Nations have the same standards. Unfortunately, though, Mr. Speaker, although one of the most egregious examples of the contaminated drinking water, the case of Sheshawan First Nation, is not an isolated incident, but it's rather part of a systemic problem which affects First Nations communities right across Canada. In fact, Health Canada has reported that as of October 31st, 2011, there were 124 First Nation communities across Canada under a drinking water advisory, often issued, Mr. Speaker, in remote or isolated northern communities. From my perspective, Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable in a country with as much wealth as Canada. This is reinforced by the fact that many of these communities are situated in close proximity to resource development projects which net both mining companies and the government through tax revenues huge gains, but often don't provide any assistance to communities living within arm's reach of these projects. Yet, although ensuring access to clean drinking water, Mr. Speaker, for First Nations communities is a laudable objective, I'm afraid that this legislation leaves much to be desired in terms of the process to achieve the desired outcome. For instance, the regulations put forward under S8 may incorporate provincial regulations governing drinking and wastewater in First Nations communities, thereby overriding the regulations set out in this bill. Here, the expert panel on safe drinking water for First Nations expressed concern about using provincial regulations, since that would result in a patchwork of regulations, leading to some First Nations having more stringent standards than others. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, this is inherently problematic, as if the intent is to ensure equitable access to clean drinking water, then implementing a patchwork system which would have different thresholds for province runs counter to what this legislation is trying to achieve, Mr. Speaker. Put simply, a provincial regime of regulation doesn't do enough to protect First Nation communities and appears to be a derogation of federal government's responsibility to provide basic services to First Nation communities. The derogation of responsibility is underscored by S8's component limiting the liability of the government for certain acts or omissions that occur in the performance of their duties under the regulations. As the federal government is meant to be the primary provider of services to First Nations communities, it seems odd, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation is attempting to limit the liability of the federal government in situations where it has failed to properly address its constitutional mandate. If the government actually believed that the regulations provided for in this legislation alone would ensure equitable access to safe drinking water in First Nations communities, then why is there a need to limit the government's liability when there is a failure in this regard, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, this brings us to the most problematic aspect of the paternalistic approach which the Conservatives continue to take with providing services to First Nations communities. The crux of the problem with this legislation is that the government thinks that regulation alone will solve the water crisis in First Nation communities. Yet we know this is not true. In addition to a regulatory overhaul, these communities require crucial investments in human resources and physical infrastructure, including drinking water and sewage systems and adequate housing. Mr. Speaker, supporting this call for increased funding, Dr. Harry Swain, Chair of the Expert Panel on Safe Drinking Water for First Nations. Dr. Swain told the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples in 2007 that this is not one of those problems in Aboriginal Canada that will persist forever and ever and ever. This is one that can be solved, and it can be solved with the application of a good chunk of money for a limited period of time. Further, Mr. Speaker, in 2011, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada commissioned an independent assessment on First Nations water and wastewater systems. The report clearly states that a significant financial commitment to infrastructure development will be necessary. It will cost $4.7 billion over 10 years to ensure the needs of First Nations communities in water and wastewater systems are met. Yet, Mr. Speaker, while the Department has called for substantive investments to improve water and wastewater systems in First Nation communities, this Conservative government has only contributed to these improvements, committing just only $330 million over 2 years in 2010 and nothing in 2011. So I would challenge my Conservative colleagues on this shortfall, and although I do expect the inevitable finger-waving and shouts, I would like to point out that a proactive approach with more substantive upfront investments in clear drinking water would likely be more cost-effective than taking a reactive approach in which the government is forced to respond to an urgent public health crisis resulting from a failure to make these investments, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I ask how much time I have left? 1 minute. So yet, as is most often the case, this Conservative government, they continue to take a penny-wise, pound-foolish approach which fails to take the cost savings of pursuing a proactive approach into account when making the always difficult choices, Mr. Speaker, about what to prioritize in terms of government spending. So in summation, Mr. Speaker, New Democrats agree that the poor standards of water systems in First Nations communities are hampering people's health and well-being. It is also causing economic hardships for persons living in these communities. This isn't a difficult problem to solve. It just requires the political will and necessary investments to get us where we need to be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.